Mathematics is objectively the worst subject, but not for the reason you think. Mathematics is the most accurate but least helpful science. Its usefulness lies in its ability to prove certain truths about reality. Yet the truth that 2 plus 2 is in fact 4 does not help us solve the many quandaries that plague human society. Science seems to be a better alternative, but its sphere is also limited to our physical presence. Where can we look for solutions to the deeper philosophical questions? I would propose that in this case, the least accurate medium may prove the most useful, a medium filled with ambiguities and uncertainties. We call them stories. An integral foundation of culture, stories have many effects on society and individuals, the most powerful of which being the ability to reconcile seemingly antithetical concepts. In terms of culture, folklorist Joseph Campbell spent a lifetime studying and compiling the mythologies of hundreds of cultures from ancient Greece to American Aboriginals. During his study, he discovered the multitude of common elements that tie these seemingly unconnected narratives together across time and space through the commonality of human origin. He concluded that mythology reflects the struggles of and between society and the individual. Campbell considers this interplay to be an unconscious result of man's constantly shifting identification of threats to his survival. For example, in the past, the community was vital to combat natural threats. Now, social groups are considered more threatening to individuals, and the stories told shift to compensate. Stories always include some change, permanent metamorphosis, whether that of physicality, mentality, or circumstance. Campbell posits that this commonality is a coping mechanism for patterns of change found in every human life. Humans tend to resist all change as harmful, but familiarizing themselves with transformation via storytelling acclimates them to the natural process. Though these similarities appear abstract, Campbell also noted that the repetition of familiar narrative elements and condensed this pattern into a sequence that he believed summarized all human stories. Colloquially called the hero's journey, Campbell's thesis is that every story follows the same essential pattern: separation, initiation, and return, which seems to indicate an unconscious connection common to all humans, or at least all storytellers. If stories are an evolutionary development to cope with the struggles of survival, what's the purpose of them now, in a society where many are free of such worries? Campbell concludes that humanity's great mystery is no longer conflict with the natural world or even society, but man himself. The modern hero is an individual, distinct from the community and meant to reconcile man to himself, and in doing so, begin to comprehend the power of the living cosmos. What does that actually mean? Simple answer is nothing, because attempting to define it further would require adherence to some sort of paradigm, which naturally entails the exclusion of at least one belief system. Campbell's insights are arguably more meaningful in the context of a concrete theology. The Bible's prophetic literature reveals the path that history has taken and will take: creation, fall, and redemption, which bears remarkable resemblance to Campbell's monomyth. Professor of New Testament interpretation Vern Poitras argues that humans seek reconciliation with something. However, he argues that it is a relationship with the living God, not union with an unspecified cosmic power. As opposed to Campbell's perspective of evolutionary naturalism, Poitras argues that stories are human beings trying to work out their purpose. Even worldviews that hold to purposelessness still attempt to fill in that blank. The life of each individual Christian is a mini redemptive narrative reflecting the greater story of creation, fall, and redemption. Stories have clear applications and learning opportunities in culture, but do they have an effect on the individual? Psychologists theorize that humans use allegory to conceptualize experience, which explains why we use metaphors to describe the sensations of everyday life. If this is true, it follows that they would best make sense of their experiences through stories that metaphorize their reality. These so-called life stories are an internalized, evolving story of the self that provides the individual a sense of unity and purpose in life. According to psychological research on the narratives people tell about their lives, there are common themes: a desire to balance autonomy and community, motivations and perspectives, and attempting to create coherence, purpose, and significance. Life stories seek to balance the polarity of the self-world divide. In specifically applying the theory of narrative identity to nursing and therapy, Professor of Caring Sciences Lena Bicklin-Houston says of stories that a narrative is fictive, not factual, but not opposed to truth. Thus, narratives could be described as truthful fictions, linked to making sense out of an experience rather than corresponding to empirical facts. Linking back to mythology and literature, stories always carry some truth of life, and indeed often communicate that truth better than direct experience. Narratives should not be reduced to methodological issues concerned with retelling past events. The reading of fiction addresses some new aspects of the social polarity introduced by narrative identity theory. Engaging with the fictional narrative is a unique encounter with this other because it is detached from real-world consequences. Humans encounter the other every day in every social interaction involving engagement. Think of reading as a controlled environment in which to experiment with self-other interactions. The crux of the matter is that empathy with, in comparison to, fictional character causes the reader to reevaluate their self-narrative. This continual evaluation is particularly healthy in young adults who have not yet developed empathy, the ability to understand other people's emotions. Literary critic Maria Nikolajeva explains that cognitive psychology has described subjects with long-term memory loss, but we do not normally empathize with brain damaged patients in clinical reports. Yet as readers of fiction, we are expected to empathize with fictional characters who undergo these same struggles. In fiction, there is a certain tendency for the reader to sympathize with the characters, allowing him or her to live the perspective of another person in a unique way not possible in real life. This same obligation exists between people who have shared their life stories. The simple reality of knowing another person and what they have experienced necessitates our sympathy for them. Oddly enough, fictionalizing reality can make it more real to someone who has never experienced those circumstances. For example, in cases such as what Delilah was discussing yesterday, reading or hearing the story of a sexual assault victim, even a fictional version of those events, forces us to confront the reality, not of that specific case necessarily, but of the possibility of the situation and its repercussions. The enduring nature of myths is such that when intellectual fads wither and die, stories live on. In his essay, Myth Became Fact, C.S. Lewis reflects on the curious presence of myth and what some claim to be a purely intellectual belief system. Rather than be embarrassed of the archaic scriptures present in modern-day Christianity, Lewis believes their presence to be necessary to its vitality. Because human intellect is abstract and the realities we experience are concrete, we cannot gain full knowledge of things like pain, pleasure, and love. The more lucidly we think, the more we are taught, and the more deeply we enter into reality, the less we can think about it. In the enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experiencing as concrete what can otherwise only be understood as abstraction. Myth is not, like truth, abstract, nor is it, like direct experience, bound to the particular. For Lewis, demythologizing Christianity is removing its essential essence, for this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet in each of us, no less than to the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. So, where does this leave us? Simply put, stories have the ability to reconcile opposing ideas, such as communities and individuals, and conflicts between individual people. The power of stories is in reconciliation, preservation of culture, and the experience of individual people. Humans would do well not to forget their roots, to continue passing on old tales and begin telling their own. It's a little bit ironic, because I spent this entire presentation trying to convince you that stories are worth caring about, but I think you've already done most of the work for me. You already care about stories in some capacity, maybe in a different way than myself or Mr. Lewis does, but we would hardly spend so much time binge-watching TV shows or reading novels if they didn't hold some meaning to us. Especially in the wake of quarantine, the primary value to us is escapism, to distract ourselves from the reality of the world or our personal circumstances. But the best stories are the ones that lead us on a fantastical journey that end right back in reality, showing us the similarities that we couldn't see before. Now, why should you personally care? Most of us aren't likely to go on to write novels. But we will live and tell stories of our own, and we will certainly continue to watch and listen to the stories created by others, fictional or otherwise. As the world influences you, so do you have the power to influence the world.
All right, thank you. Well done. Do we have any questions or comments for Emma?
Wow, you threw me into a state of cognitive dissonance there. I really appreciate your deep thinking. I didn't say that to be a smart aleck. I often talk about the Bible as biblical narratives rather than biblical stories. I think, am I too picky when I do that? Because that's where the dissonance is coming, because story to me implies fiction. The Bible is not fiction. The Bible is historical truth. How would you explain that? How would you respond to me?
To clarify, I probably should have said this in the beginning, but I was using stories in a sense that didn't necessarily imply fiction, because I was talking about the life narratives as well, which aren't fictional. So I should clarify at the beginning. I don't consider stories to necessitate fiction. It can imply that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
One of the things that you said that stood out to me is you said when people are reading the stories, they reevaluate themselves, right? That was an interesting concept. So, of course, then I started thinking, so reevaluating myself, does that mean that people are comparing themselves to what they're reading? How does comparison work with the reevaluating?
So, I mean, in part, often enough stories, especially directed to young people, you're meant to kind of empathize with the main character and sort of like, this person is just like you, they're going through experiences like you. So especially in young adult literature or other kinds of fiction, you'll find protagonists that you're supposed to relate to, and sometimes, yeah, like you're supposed to look at their journey and go, that's my journey. I can overcome this challenge too, or I already have, and it's comforting to know that someone else has already done this as well.
Yeah. And I also, when you were talking, I actually wrote down Netflix, right? So I'm actually glad that you brought that up. It's sad to me that people don't read, they watch TV, but whatever. So do you really think that the Netflix stories are really the same as an actual written story? And I ask that because, you know, the book's always better than the movie, right? I totally, completely agree. So how do you expand on that a little bit more?
So the question of artistic mediums, personal preference, I love the novel because it's the most kind of intimate experience of reading or hearing a story in any way. I don't have Netflix, but I've seen TV shows, and they tend to be better developed and tend to have kind of weaker themes. But I think that's because like they're kind of treated like something to be consumed, to be entertainment or amusement and not entertainment, you know. So they're not necessarily trying to get you to think, but I think there's a potential within the medium that we're kind of working towards as we make more of it, like the potential to turn it from entertainment to art. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It has a potential. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but I get the concept. But I at least appreciated that you at least put that in there because you have to say something about that, and that's where we are.
But think about stories that have been written and then turned into movies. I've not ever seen a movie of a book that I've read where the movie was better. There's just so much missing.
What's your advice to us as we're reading a story? Give us concrete advice. You dealt on a highly conceptual level in that presentation, which I thought was quite mature and quite well offered. But as I'm reading a story, what should I be thinking about?
You should be, because stories are amusement, but they're also entertainment. So there's an aspect where you should enjoy it because it's art and it's beautiful. So appreciate what's beautiful about it. Appreciate its flaws because all art is flawed. Understand what could be done better and why it is the way it is. And like think about, your real life, the real world you live in. How does this apply? What are the similarities and differences? What can I learn from these people or this world that doesn't actually exist, but is still connected to mine?
That's a really good answer. When I read Les Miserables, which is a long read, I literally wept the last 50 pages for the depth of it. don't know if anybody in here has read that novel. And I love the stage plays, the music's very inspiring, but there's nothing like grabbing the words off of a page and the story of redemption and Jean Valjean and all the things that happen, Javert, it's just remarkable. So I guess I would challenge people in this audience to seek some classic literature. That's an understandable piece. I'm a reader and I was an English major, so I have a lot of practice. But I would challenge all of you to go beyond some superficial narratives and fiction or nonfiction and really get some depth. I've seen the stuff you read. I ask you, and I think, whoa, okay, you're not typical.
In a good way.
Yeah, I meant that in a higher compliment.
Emma, I had a couple things. First of all, fantastic job, because that's a really big idea that you're trying to pack into a short presentation, regardless of how anybody else in the room feels about it. But I love that. So revisiting Lewis's idea about the true myth. The idea being not so much that it's like Dr. Silver was trying to communicate. We often think of myth as just purely in value of fiction, right? That a myth is valuable only in the sense that it's telling us a story that didn't actually happen. And his whole argument was that a myth explains something that's true in a way of whether or not the events it's retelling actually happened. And I love, and that's the essay that we shared or whatever, that Lewis refers to the Bible as the true myth, because not only does it communicate in the way that a myth does, it has the added benefit of it actually happened. So all of that epic stuff, that circle that Carol talked to, was it Carol that talked about all of these myths have in common, you find in the biblical narrative, only it's true. Like it's the story that everybody longs for. That's highlight more than commentary. I got so much. So the question there is, literature is art. You mentioned stories are beautiful. They're intended to be beautiful. Some of them are beautiful in the most tragic way. When we're talking about literature as art, though, maybe that's the question. How is literature artful or an artwork or artistic when typically we think of art, there's really nothing to look at? We've been talking about TV, movies, and so on. Like, that's something visually that we can experience. Maybe the soundtrack we can hear, but like all those sensory things are happening. A story is just like, it's all happening. It's so internal. How can that be something beautiful or artful?
I think that is something unique about, particularly we're talking about novels and literature here, is that it doesn't provide the sensory experience for you. You have to kind of make it yourself, which is, we're human beings, we're created with this imagination. And so each of us puts like our own individual spin on this story. We all imagine it in slightly different ways, which makes it so much more personal than to have. It's wonderful to listen to music somebody else composed and played, or to watch like an animation or an artwork that somebody drew. That's also like that's their artwork. In terms of literature, it very much becomes your story because you're creating it out of your own mind in a unique way.
And very well said. And that's the final note that I wrote for myself is really you're arguing between the value of story is, and tell me if I'm communicating this the right way. Your project is largely trying to prove that understanding truth is not as great of a thing as experiencing truth. And stories enable us not just to understand an argument, like what it's ironic that here I am trying to prove something to you where there's a better way to prove something to you, namely by way of a story. And that's what literature has to offer us, is experiencing truth as opposed to I don't want to say just understanding. Understanding truth is important. But when you're involved in a story in such a way, you don't just understand it. It doesn't just make sense to you. You're experiencing that truth.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily, experiencing truth isn't necessarily more valuable than understanding truth.
Right.
But as human beings, we're rational, but we're also irrational, and we have limits of what we can understand. And so that's why the experiential aspect is so important, because, we kind of colloquially, we get it, even if we can't really explain it or understand it. because there's a limit to like what our rational minds can handle, and that's why stories are valuable, because they can like, teach us this experience that we couldn't have in real life, and we can't articulate necessarily.
Well said. Classmates, you got anything for Emma?
Well, art is, including literature, is a blank slate when you're creating it and when you're experiencing it. So as anybody, two different people read the same book, and you have your different picture of what that book looked like and what the characters look like. Or you read the book, you're kind of creating things in your own mind. And then you maybe see a movie and you're like, that's not what that character is supposed to look like, because you created your own art in your own mind. You've experienced it. Or if you're writing your own, it is just a blank slate. Same thing with writing poetry or creating a song or whatever. It is a blank slate.
Can I throw on there one more thing? Oh, sorry, did somebody?
Some of that definitely went over my head, but I did want to ask, like, you talk a lot about beauty, and I just was curious how you would like advise us as people who hopefully will go and read, a meaningful book or a meaningful story. Like, how would you advise us to like admire that beauty without like idolizing that beauty?
So it really comes down to what like the source of beauty is, and kind of what our standard for it is. We talked about beauty standards, and beauty tends to be a little bit subjective, but in terms of more than the physical appearance and the value of something, and like I'm not going to go up here and say I can define beauty, because people try to do that for some reason, but I know there's just the source of beauty is really God. Cheesy there, but I think it's true, and I'm going to argue for it, is that like, being with God is the source of beauty, and like through modern day, we have that creative aspect to us that we get from God, and we use it to create beautiful things. And so it's like, so we look at them and we love them because they're beautiful. And in order to not idolize them, we have to understand first this came from human being. Second of all, it's flawed. So we need to be able to recognize the flaws in it and still appreciate it, and appreciate essentially whose idea it really was. Does that make sense?
Couldn't have said it better. Just one more anecdote. I love that, like, it's precisely what you said, that God is the ground of all that creativity, right? But that God is himself creative, and that he's created a creation that also creates. And our creativity versus God's creativity, reflecting his image in just a mind-blowing way. And I'm super interested in how often God uses, especially in the teachings of Jesus, you find Jesus pointing to parts of creation and using them as analogous to a higher truth or a metaphor for something bigger. But what's so crazy about it is when Jesus points to something saying, I am like this, or you are like this, he created that thing, right? Like he created our digestive system and bread. And so when he says, I'm the bread of life, we totally get what he means. So it's like, I wonder if he kind of meant to do that, like like he's creating these things so that down the road he can use them as a metaphor to teach us something that can only be taught by way of, you can tell me what hunger is all day long. Until I feel hungry, I don't. That's why I use the word experiencing there. Until I feel that hunger, it's not going to mean as much to me. Just trying to prove to me that you're the bread of life, and I'm fascinated by that. Anyways, sorry, that's my anecdote. Any other thoughts? Last call. Thank you, Emma. Well done.